Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today we're going to be discussing the subject of perpetual travelers, people who essentially have no residency anywhere. They kind of bounce from place to place. They go on extended vacations from one area to another, potentially avoiding being tax resident anywhere. I'm going to cover kind of the legalities of that, how it works, how it doesn't work, some of the things that you should be aware of, and let you know whether it's something that if you're interested in that thing. I mean, there's two ways that you can do it. The one way is to say, hey, listen, I'm always traveling. The other is to have like a series of homes and to rotate between them. So I'm going to cover that for you, let you know how that works from a tax standpoint, and we're going to get into that. Before we do that, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, make sure you don't miss out on any of our future videos. We really appreciate you subscribing. If you like the videos, please share them with friends. Check out some of our other videos. I hope you enjoy them. If you have any feedback, please leave them in the comments below. Very much appreciate it. If you would like me to produce some content on something, please put it in the comments below. And if you're interested at all in the subjects that we talk about on this channel, which is basically we help you to figure out what is the best structure for international business and international living, how to minimize your taxes as low as possible, protect your assets, set up the right banking, set up the right investments, etc., as well as actually helping you with implementing that, so forming companies, opening bank accounts, getting residency permits, getting citizenships, etc., then please reach out to me. You can book a call, clarity.fm/Michael Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or you can check out our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com, and you can send us a message from there. Okay, so there's this idea of perpetual travelers, all right? And, I think at a certain level, especially when you're younger, the idea has some allure. I think as people get older, they tend to be a little bit more settled. Maybe they have a family or something. It's tougher to do that. Although I do have some friends who I really respect. They've got a few kids and they manage to travel pretty much constantly, and good on them, right? But that's definitely a more difficult thing than if you're young and single, or maybe newly married, or you have some friends to travel with, or whatever, something like that. That's how it goes. Now, there's this kind of idea that, hey, listen, by never spending, let's call it more than 6 months, but it could be, let's say, more than 3 or 4 months in a country at a time, and just changing countries, you could not be tax resident anywhere. And as a result, this could be a hack to not pay taxes, right? Let's just use an example. Say you love the south of France. France happens to be a pretty high tax country. You like Spain. Spain happens to be a high tax country. And let's say you like Australia. Australia happens to be a high tax country. But you divide your time between these 3 different places. And as a result, maybe a little bit other traveling in there, you never cross the threshold of being a tax resident in those places. And therefore, conceivably, you don't have to pay taxes, even though you're kind of residing in those places. So does that work? And is that something that you could consider? So this is very case by case. And in general, when we're talking about these subjects, I always tell people this is case by case. I had a call with some clients earlier this evening, and it was 3 partners, and like every single person had a different situation, right? It's very complex. And you couldn't just say, hey, here's the solution we're going to use for all 3 of you. It's like every single one of them has to have their own plan. So the same goes for you, right? Let's just use an example. If you are from someplace like the US, well, then you more or less can't do this, right? You can get away with the foreign earned income exclusion, of course, but you're not going to get away from your US citizenship that way, and so you're still going to be under US citizenship-based taxation, right? That's one. Then you could be from someplace like Canada and Australia. Canada and Australia mostly don't want you to be tax resident nowhere, okay? Generally speaking, there are some exceptions to this, but generally speaking, if you are not tax resident somewhere else, you will default back to your country of citizenship in those cases. And there's a bunch of countries that are like this, okay? So on the flip side, there's some countries that allow you to be tax resident nowhere, right? It's just, the thing that I talk about is the difference between being tax resident and being non-tax resident, okay? So for instance, in some places it's like, hey, if you spend more than 183 days, you're tax resident. If you don't spend 183 days, you're not tax resident. It's just very clean and clear. There's some places like that. A lot of places are not like that. So you really, really have to be cautious around that, okay? It's like, quite different. So if you're from one of those countries where it's not so clear like that, well, then this option doesn't really work very well for you, okay? And I'll give you a strategy in a minute for how you might deal with that in your particular situation for you. The Other group of people though, they potentially have this as an option, right? So if you do, well, what about these other countries that you're in? You need to be pretty careful here, okay? If you're habitually a resident in some of these places, one of the things I've talked about, I did a video quite a while back on kind of residency and how residency works, etc. And a lot of people seem to have the idea that, hey, listen, so long as I don't spend 183 days there, I'm not a resident. And that's often not true. Often, if you have sufficient ties, if your home is genuinely there, you could spend, 10 months away and still be tax resident in that place. So let's say that you were doing like I was mentioning here, Spain, south of France, Australia. And let's say that you kind of like established homes in each of those places and you rotated. You could potentially be taxable in a couple of those places, okay? It's not so simple as saying, hey, listen, well, I'm not in any of them for, this time. In addition to that, you do risk triggering some kind of permanent establishment rules, okay? So that again can cause some problems with the situation you're in. Now, if you're gonna do this in countries that are, I would call like not very organized, you wanna do it in a bunch of Latin American countries, you wanna do it in various Eastern European countries, et cetera. That's the least of their worries. You're probably gonna be fine, right? That being said, in some of these more organized countries where they have more data, they have more ability to check, and they care a lot more about this stuff, you still might get away with it, but you should be really careful because, clearly you're more or less living part of the year there, and your income is arguably from, like, your work is taking place in that place, and you're probably exercising a role in such a sense that you might be considered a permanent establishment, and therefore that could result in taxation, okay? So be very careful which countries you're doing this, how nailed down you are, right? It's very different if you're in hotels traveling around, right? But if you actually say, hey, listen, well, I'm gonna have a permanent apartment there, right? I'm gonna have that apartment all year round, whether I buy it and own it or whether I just have a 12-month lease, something to watch out for, okay? So what do you do then as an alternative? What I would say, well, actually, before I go on to that, let me just kind of give another piece for that second group of people, the people who are in a country where it's not so clear that you can just escape their residency situation. There's often exceptions to this if you're willing to stay out long enough. So let's just say you're from Australia. Australia has pretty tough rules. The ATO has been known to be very aggressive about going after people who have gone away and come back, okay? That being said, if your attitude is, hey, listen, I'm leaving Australia, I'm never moving back to Australia. That's it. Like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, like my home is going to be abroad. Then you're in a very different situation than if you intend to come back. So the thing that I want to really caution you is think closely about, do you intend to come back? If you intend to come back in the next year or 2 or 3, very, very different than if you're saying, hey, listen, I'm going to go back, or I'm not going to go back. Okay, so that's something. And even if you're out, like typically in most cases, country by country again, but if you're out for 7 years, then usually that's enough. It's like, okay, well, they clearly were gone. This is not a case of just going on an extended vacation or something like that. Okay, so where does that leave you? Well, generally the advice that I give people is, if possible, go to a country where you have a tax treaty. Do actually get a residency permit there to get out of the system that you're in. Okay, that's the first thing. And then second of all, if you can maintain some sort of a residency permit that you can kind of like point to that as your residency, and then you want to bounce around like this, you're just going to be far safer, far better off than if you try and be based nowhere. And this brings us to the last point, which is part of the problem with being a perpetual traveler today is banking and financial infrastructure. A lot of the times, in fact, pretty much all the time, they want a proof of address, they want to know where you're resident, etc. And if you can't point to somewhere, then that can cause problems. Now, it's not always a problem, but it can often cause problems. And so it's much, much better if you can say, okay, great, here's where I'm resident, here's where I have a utility bill, here's where you can send things, here's where I pay my taxes. Oh, it happens that there's no taxes there, that's great, and off you go. So anyway, I hope that helps. If you have any questions about it, please reach out to me, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share the video with your friends, click the like button, all that kind of stuff. If you have any comments on improve, happy to hear from you. If you'd like to see some content from me, let me know. And I'm going to see you guys on the next video.